Good afternoon. I'm Steve Holloway and I'm the Chair of the Management Group. I'm pleased to be introducing the Management Group webinar on developing your approach to communication. This is a collaborative webinar between the Management Group and the IMechE's Learning and Development team and will be run by Andy Webber. And this is a follow-on from a very successful face-to-face version of this subject which Andy ran at the Essential Management Skills Conference last year. Andy is a principal consultant in the IMechE's L&D team and has been part of the team for over 18 years, covering a variety of roles and responsibilities. He is responsible for designing and delivering workshops and events focused on developing leadership skills and capacity, as well as managing relationships with clients and customers. Whilst clients are typically in the engineering sector, he does work in many other sectors across the world. This webinar is a live webinar, so a couple of things just to bear in mind. There will be some polls which Andy will ask you to take part of, which we'd love it if you would put your answers in. And also Andy will be asking you some questions as we go through. It would be great if you could write your thoughts in the Ask a Question area. Also, if you have any other questions about the overall topic, please write those in there and we'll come back to those at the end of the session when we go into our proper Q&A in the last half an hour. So that's all for me from now. I'll come back with some questions and it's over to you now, Andy.
Great, thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session. Thanks for that kind introduction, Steve. So today we're talking about communication, and just give you a little bit of a quick agenda. Broadly speaking, we're going to explore the communication process, and in particular, we're going to focus on the face-to-face communication process, because of course, there are all kinds of different ways of communicating in the modern world, but we're going to still focus on the face-to-face process and then allow you to extend that and think about the nuances and challenges associated with some of the other ways of communicating. In particular, we're going to look at what goes wrong in communication, and really the principle of this session is to understand the importance of perspective in the whole process. I'm going to start today by telling you a little story. And it's a story that it's actually derives into a Japanese saying. And the Japanese saying is, and apologies for anyone whose Japanese is a lot better than mine, which will be pretty much everyone. It goes, Ino naka no kawazu, taikai o shirazu. And while I was researching for this webinar, I found this picture of somebody with that exact saying tattooed on their back. And what it means is the frog in the well doesn't know about the wide ocean. It's a bit like one of our, what we would have in the UK as an Aesop's fable, or like the fox and the sour grapes. And so behind this story, this is the moral behind the story. So just to give you an abridged version of this story, there's a frog, and he's living in a well. And he was born and raised in the well, never lived anywhere else. And if you can look past the plot flaws, by the way, there's plenty in this little story. There often are these kind of things. He's sitting on the side of the well one day, and a turtle plops into the well. I don't quite know how the turtle gets there, but it does. And the frog goes, "Oh, hello, Mr. Turtle." And the turtle says, "Hello, Mr. Frog. How are you today?" And the frog says, "I'm good, thanks." And he says, "Well, what have you been up to?" And the turtle says, "Well, I've been swimming around in the ocean." And the frog says, "The ocean? Well, what's that?" And the turtle says, "What do you mean, what's the ocean? It's this big expanse of water." And the frog thinks to himself for a moment and says, "Big expanse of water? You mean halfway across the well?" And the turtle looks a bit shocked at this comment and says, "Well, no. You've got completely the wrong scale of this. I mean a really huge expanse of water." And the frog says, "Well, all the way across the well?" And the turtle shakes his head and leaves, which I recognise as another plot flaw, but nonetheless, he does. And so it goes on. There's several iterations of this with a stork and a similar story with the sky. So I just want you to reflect on that and think about what you think the morals of this story are. And we're going to come back to it a little bit later on. First, I want to think about the process of communication. And as I mentioned, we're going to look at one-to-one, face-to-face. And so you can see two people here. And those of you that perhaps involved in the right areas of technology might recognize this jargon, TX, RX. TX stands for transmitter, and RX stands for receiver in mobile radio technology. For example, quite often base stations are labeled as TX and RX. So the point here is that I want you to imagine an even more unrealistic situation where this is very much one-way communication, with the transmitter having a message to send to the receiver. Now, that's not unrealistic, but it's unrealistic in that I'm going to ask you to think about it as very much one way. All communication is two-way, of course. So we have our transmitter, and the transmitter has an intended message to send. And I want you to imagine that you are the transmitter for a minute. And I want you to imagine that this is an important message. There's something crucial that you need to transmit to somebody else. Now, in that kind of scenario, you probably take stock, take a moment to think, consider exactly how you're going to get this message across. You might not write notes, you might not, inverted commas, prepare for the communication, but you'd probably take a moment to stop and think about, right, what's the best way to communicate this message? And once you've done that, once you've got the right way to go about it, you will communicate it. There it goes, blue arrow. And then I want you to think about the other side. So what happens on the other side? When you're receiving a message, listening effectively, or hearing, but in one-to-one communication, hopefully listening, you get the words, and the words go into your ears and into your brain, and then your brain processes the data that it's receiving. And that the act of processing means you're trying to understand what it is that the transmitter is telling you. And in the end, the receiver ends up with an interpreted meaning, i.e., at the end of communication, the receiver's received, and he, in this case, has got a clear picture of what she, the transmitter, was saying, we hope. At least that's the goal in communication, that intended message should equal. I couldn't find an approximately equal symbol on my PowerPoint, but that's probably more realistic, that one should be more or less equal to the other. That's what successful communication looks like. So in a few slides' time, we're going to go back to this and think about what might go wrong in communication. But first, I just want to explore how we communicate. What is it that we use when we're communicating with someone face-to-face? And it boils down to three things. We've got words, very obviously. We've then got the way that we say the words, the tone, the inflection that we put on the words. And in face-to-face communication, again, stressing that, there is also the body language that we use to transmit messages. Now, there's a bit of an urban myth grown up around this and the relative importance of these three things in the context of communication. Because somebody, a guy called Albert Morabian, this is he, did some research some years ago on communication. And what he was doing was exploring the relative importance of those three elements in communicating a message. He was asking himself, well, okay, we've got these three pieces, if you like, to get our message across. What's the relative importance of these three when we're communicating? And he allocated, in the end, he allocated percentage. He added them up to 100%. So this is time for our first poll. I want to get you to answer that question. What do you think is the answer to that question? How do you see it? When we're communicating a message, what is the relative importance of words, tone, and body language in the transmission of the message. So if you could just open your poll option and answer what you think. Okay, good. We have the results. The results are in, as they say. So we have 78.3% less than 25%. We've got between 25 and 75 as 13%, and more than 75% is 8.7%. Let's call it 9. So it's a very interesting result, and it's almost the result I expected. And this is the slight urban myth that has grown up around this guy's research. He actually gets very frustrated with people like me misrepresenting his research. And I've slightly tricked you in asking the question, because the question I asked wasn't clear enough, which is ironic given the community. It was an intentional thing, obviously, but it wasn't clear enough for you to really answer the question. If I ask you the question again, and I'm not going to do this in a poll context, but if I asked you, if you're communicating technical data, technical information to a colleague, what are the percentages for the 3 elements then? I'm sure you'd recognize that you can't communicate technical data with your tone and your body language. It's almost all in the words, perhaps 98, 99%, certainly upper 90s, maybe even 100% in the words. And that the tone and the body language becomes unimportant. Where tone and body language becomes incredibly important is where we're talking about the communication of feelings. In fact, this is what Mehrabian's research related to. And where it's miscommunicated is people generalize it to be about communication in general. Not true. Mehrabian's research was about when we're communicating feelings. So if we could look at the same example where we're communicating technical data, okay, the data itself is transmitted using the words almost exclusively, but when we're receiving technical data, we would make a judgment as to how that person felt about the technical data. Perhaps, for example, how confident they were in their figures, or whether they found it interesting or boring, etc., etc. In the context of communication of feelings, the words become much less important. So if you could scroll down to the poll again and click to the right, there is poll number 2. So I want to ask you the same question again. In relation to feelings, I say the same question again, not true. A similar question, but a bit more specific. So in relation to feelings, what percentage of the message is transmitted using words now? Give you a moment to answer. And you just hate pregnant pauses. Why is it called a pregnant pause, by the way? Don't understand. That's a good question. So, Jade, do we have the results yet? Still some people answering. It's another reason that face-to-face communication is better, because there's no technical difficulties and no lag on the line. Wondering if there's an issue with the poll. Okay. It's not showing on my screen, interestingly, but we have the results are in. We have less than 25%, 67%, 25, between 25 and 75, we have 14% and 10%. So, Morabian's research showed this, that only 7% of the message is communicated with the words when we're talking about feelings. And again, if I can go back to that same example, someone's technical data, if they sound or look nervous about the information that they're sending you, if they tell you that they're confident, but they sound and they look unsure, you probably wouldn't believe that they were confident. When I get home from work in the evening and my wife says, I say, how are you? And she says, oh, I'm fine. I know pretty much for sure that she's not fine at all. So the importance of the words is not huge when we're talking about feelings. But conversely, and Morabian himself gets very upset when people misquote him, and I've seen him misquoted in a TV advert. So it's become quite a widely quoted or misquoted piece of research, that it's not communication in general, it's just communication of feelings. Go back to our transmit and receive. And I just want to get your thoughts on this one. So if you can get ready to type some comments into the questions area. I'd just like to get your thoughts on when the intended message doesn't equal the interpreted meaning, i.e., when miscommunication has occurred, what do you think are the possible causes? So if you could just type in the questions area, what are the, basically, broadly speaking, what are the possible causes of miscommunication? What could go wrong? You can look at both sides, by the way. What could go wrong on the transmit side, what could go wrong on the receive side, but in particular, I'm interested on the transmitting side. That's the side we're going to be focusing on today, although I'll briefly mention at the end something about receiving. Not sure if anyone's typing anything because I can't see anything on my screen. Not sure why that might be. Perhaps you will just flat out ignoring me. Helen, thank you. I've got a comment from Helen that says, I have heard what I expected to hear, not what was being told. Okay. So on the receiver side, sometimes we think we know what the transmitter is going to say, and we hear that rather than what they actually said. Joanna said, not understanding what you're asking, lack of information, assuming someone knows. Good, yeah. Deliverer doesn't think about the receiver will receive the message. Good, thank you, Jonathan. Not trusting the sources which is often this particular person speaks. Okay, So Mark mentioning that your image or your perspective of the transmitter might change the way that you receive a message. If you trust them or distrust them, or neutral, or you respect or you don't respect, etc., it will change the way potentially that you receive the message. Language, not hearing the complete message. Language barrier, yeah, most obviously language is probably the main thing that can go wrong, particularly from the transmitter side, if we're using the wrong language. And by the wrong language, I might mean French versus English, but I also might mean jargon. And there's a bit more of a subtle version of language as well, which I want to explore in just a second. Justin, speaker assumes received a similar understanding on knowledge. Yeah, okay. So it's about misjudging the level at which you're pitching the message. Perhaps, Justin, for example, you might talk to me in a technical engineering way, and that I don't get that. Using words with multiple meanings, Wayne. Exactly. And that's the more subtle version of language that I was going to explore in just a second, so I'll come back to that. Distracted. Yeah, it could be that the listener's not just physically not listening, distracted by something else. Claire's comments very similar to one of the ones from previous, that about the receiver knowledge not being the right level. Good. Okay. So just going back to this language thing, if I was to call you ignorant, how would you receive that? If I just said to you, you're ignorant, I think there's a pretty good job you'd be offended. What does ignorant actually mean? Well, what it means and what it's come to mean and what it meant originally are all different things. It actually derives from this Latin word, which I don't know how to pronounce correctly. I'm going to go with ignorare, but I have no idea if that's correct, which means not knowing. So not knowing something doesn't sound like much of an insult, but calling someone ignorant really does sound like a bit of an insult. And there are multiple meanings of the word ignorant. And it's one of those words that we could easily misinterpret if we're on the receiving end of. If we're not knowing about something or lacking knowledge about something and we're called ignorant, being ignorant tends to carry a bit more of a connotation of being stupid in some way. So it's really the difference between number 1 and number 2 on the slide on the screen. The interesting thing about miscommunication, though, if I can summarize, is that if we look at it from the transmitter side, there's really 2 big chunks in relation to miscommunication. One is just that the transmitter transmits gobbledygook. I mean, I could throw my words up in the air and land on the ground and just say them in a different order, and no one would understand that. But usually it's a bit more personal. Usually it's something to do with so many of the comments that you wrote into the chat box about misjudging somehow the receiver and misjudging their level, for example. Now, miscommunication can be a problem or it cannot be a problem. Anyone recognize this gentleman here? I'll give you a moment to consider who that might be, but he said that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. That is to say that when the intended message does not equal the interpreted meaning, that's a problem when both the transmitter and receiver are unaware that that's the case. Usually, if one of us, either the transmitter or the receiver, realizes that there's been a problem in this communication, we'll put it right. Either receiver will ask a question, say, what do you mean by? Or the transmitter will sense somehow that they haven't got the message clearly and try again. So the problem really occurs when we think communication has taken place, but it hasn't. And this, actually I haven't checked the chat if anybody actually put a comment in there. but this guy is George Bernard Shaw, as I'm sure many of you may well know. I've just noticed TLA's comment from Claire. Yeah, TLA's and jargon. And that's one of the unusual situations where, in this case, the receiver knows they haven't understood, but actually might not clarify. We don't like looking stupid. When we feel like we ought to know something, we ought to know a piece of jargon or a three-letter abbreviation, ironically a TLA, and we might not ask the question because we don't want to look stupid. So it's one of the few situations where George Bernard Shaw's comment, not really the right word, but doesn't apply. So another little interaction part for you, something I would like you to take part in, and it involves describing London. And I want you to think about, I guess many of you might live in London, or at least visit London, or have visited London, or even if you've never been, you probably know something a little bit about London. I want you to think about this gentleman. He's a commuter. And I want you to just type some words, if you wouldn't mind, into the question box again, about what you think this person might say about London. Adjectives, probably. About how do you think a commuter would describe the city of London? In this case, what's his view of London? Would you mind just typing some comments? Very definite time lag on my screen. Hopefully they will come through soon, assuming you're writing some. Brawling. Thank you, Claire. Busy, hectic, rush. Another busy. Another busy. Work, crowded, expensive, time consuming. Yeah. Good. Okay. Just like you to reset and think about this guy, a homeless person living in London. What do you think a homeless person might say about London? And to answer your question, Murat, you've just written in the comment box that we're using. Correct. Same thing. That's the same area. If you can use the question box to write your comments. Busy, overcrowded, challenging. That's still about the commuter. So what would a homeless person say? Unfriendly, unwelcoming, hopeless, cold. Cruel, lonely. Yeah. Unfriendly, unsafe. Yeah, struggle, lonely. So you can see, and I could ask you if we had time to do the same thing for a tourist, and you would write slightly different words. Same thing, same city, and different people describing in different ways. And this is, I guess, the crux of what we're talking about today, is the fact that we all see the world in slightly different ways. We all have our own perspective. This is one of the presuppositions from a body of work called NLP, which I'm guessing many of you will have heard of. People see things from their map of the world rather than the way the world really is. It's not quite similar. Anyway, it's very close to one of the presuppositions. And the principle of this is the fact that we need to recognize that people see things differently. And that has a massive impact when we're communicating. And it brings us all the way back to our frog in his well. I actually prefer perspective sounds nice and wide and open. So recognizing that we all have a different perspective on things is useful. It's important. It's fundamental. But I think it's healthier when we're thinking about this introspectively, when we're looking at our own perspective, to recognize that our perspective is more of a well, really. Each of our perspectives is actually quite limited. Our perspective is shaped more by what we don't know than what we do know. And understanding that actually our view of the world is really, relatively speaking, narrow. When you think about the amount of stuff that you know compared to the amount of stuff that you don't know, you begin to realize just how little each one of us does know. Think of all the university degrees you haven't done. So we're all limited by our own little well. And it's important to recognize that when we're communicating, we need to get our message across to the other person in terms that they understand. NLP talks about filters, talks about the fact that our perspective acts essentially as a filter when we're receiving information. So effective communication is about when we're transmitting a message, it's about getting into the mind, getting into the understanding. It's about seeing the world from the other person's perspective, understanding their well, if you like, and using the right words that will help us to transmit the message in their terms. Now, I figured we'd be running out of time about now, and we are. So I just want to run through the next couple of bits quite quickly. That is the main point of today's session, really, that we need to understand other people's perspectives in order to communicate effectively. But how? Hopefully we already kind of understood this. How do we adapt our message? How do we understand better? And how do we communicate better? I just want to share with you one thing. There's obviously using better words based on the other person's perspective, but there's also an attitudinal change that you can make. Now, this iceberg, as you can see, looks a bit like a tooth, I always thought, but this is actually an iceberg. And this iceberg is a metaphor for a human being. And in relation to humans, what we see is their behavior. And what we don't see, what's under the surface, is a whole host of things, actually. I've just written some examples here. People's values drive their behavior, their beliefs, people's personality, all of those at a fairly deep level, all of which can be changed by someone's mood. Someone who's a very patient person could be in a very bad mood and act very impatiently. So the mood is a bit more of a superficial thing nearer the surface, but still a factor in terms of the way in which people behave. So what's under the surface here is what's driving our behavior. I just want to focus on one of the important things here, which is our attitude. And there's something that I want to share with you now that is another one of the presuppositions from NLP, which essentially is an attitude shaper. And it's hopefully when you're communicating, you're not getting that kind of response from the lady on the screen, but I'm sure you've had that response to an SMS text message at some point. You meant something as a joke and somebody took it seriously. The meaning of your communication is the response that you get. The meaning of your communication is the response that you get. Now, we could analyze that for some time, and we'd probably agree by the end of it that it's not really fair. It's not fair that I should take responsibility for your response in some circumstances. As a general principle, though, what this is doing is it's asking you to think about your communication and think about the responses that you're getting, because the response that you're getting after you've communicated and during the communication, it's the receiver's response and it's based on their interpreted meaning. when we transmit a message, we can't look into somebody's head and see what they've understood. The only chance we've got of understanding whether or not we've been successful is by looking at their responses. And this, thinking this way, shaping your attitude this way, is about recognizing that we can, by drawing out responses or observing responses in body language and facial expression in particular, and focusing on those, we can start to make a bit of a judgment as to whether or not we've managed to get our message across. So this thinking this way, it's not necessarily fair. Nobody's saying that we should take responsibility for every other person's response post-communication. But in terms of an attitude shaper to the way in which you communicate, it will tend to, remembering that we're going back to the situation where this is an important message, it will tend to focus your mind on the responses that you're getting as well as the words that you're using, and hopefully thinking about the other person's perspective. So it's your only chance, really. Their response is your only chance of making a judgment as to whether or not your intended message has got through. So I'm going to hand over in about 2 minutes to Steve to handle any questions or help me to handle any questions. But just briefly, very, very briefly, I also want to mention that, of course, we can take responsibility on the receiver side too. Today's mainly been about thinking about the other person's perspective and their well in terms of transmission of messages, but we can also take responsibility by actively listening for receiving also. And in particular, this area here, this is about opening up our own filters in order to make it easier for the transmitter to transmit to us. So, just on that final thought, I want to summarize by saying we need to recognize that we all live in our own version of the well. And just as a final example of a little bit of miscommunication, or not necessarily miscommunication, but slightly misleading communication, I said earlier on that when I was researching for the webinar, I found this picture, and probably you assumed that I found it on the internet. I actually found it on my phone, because this is a picture of my back with this Japanese saying on my left shoulder to remind me constantly, like a conscience, that everybody lives in their own version of the well. If you're interested in more about thinking about your own perspective and what shapes that, we don't not even have close. It's a whole new webinar subject. There's some very interesting TED Talks on that topic, which I'll leave for you on the screen if you'd like to explore those later, and perhaps we'll do another webinar on that in the future. Thank you very much for listening. And Steve, I'll hand back to you to see if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. That was absolutely fantastic and quite insightful. We're going to open it up for any questions and answers. So I know most of you have been using the questions for comments so far. If you have got any questions, please put them in the same area. I noticed a couple of comments just coming through saying you couldn't quite see where to write comments. Just going forward, it will be in the Ask a Question box. If you just move down the screen to attendee questions and write any questions you've got in there. I'll just give that a few minutes for some to come through. And just to remind you, this is part of the management group's webinar streams. We've got another one coming up in February where we're going to be doing something around introduction to finance. So just to give you a heads up on what we might be doing next time, and that will be in around about February. So just waited for any questions to come through. We've got about 20 minutes. So if anyone's got any specific questions or any issues that they'd like to get some insights on from Andy, quite happy to take those, and I'm sure Andy can give some advice. So let's just pick up this one. So Andy, an interesting question here. So, dealing with passive aggression, particularly among women, if you are naturally a more direct, clear-speaking person, how do you deal with passive-aggressive communication without appearing to be the aggressor?
Well, that's an interesting one. This is about, in my view, it's about the importance of intent versus reception. Now, to some extent, this is a bit of a judgment call. It's an opinion, but when we communicate, we communicate with an intent, and the receiver receives with and gets a feeling about what we intended. So I might say something to someone meaning to be assertive, let's say, but the person on the other side receives it as aggressive. It's a good example of how I need to adjust my message to their world, to their perspective, in order to get my message across effectively, because I didn't intend to be aggressive, but they received it as aggressive. What that saying, the NLP presupposition suggests, the meaning of my communication, is the response that you get. Whether I intended to be aggressive or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is that the other person perceived me to be aggressive. And because I didn't intend that, I failed. So it's about me taking the time to think about and make the best judgment. And this is not, we can't be perfect on this. It's about understanding what is going to come across as aggressive to the other person, and what's going to come across as being assertive to the other person. Assertiveness is good. Aggressive is obviously bad. I didn't fully understand the comment about particularly among women. If you can clarify that, then that'd be great. One final comment on that, because you might be a little bit surprised to hear somebody like me say this, but we can go too far. I think there are some people around these days, particularly on social media, who seem to go out there with the express intention of being offended by everything. And no matter what you do, you're going to cause those people offense. You didn't mean to, but they were determined to be offended by absolutely everything you say. Exclude that group from this. We're talking about people who are not deliberately being offended by things. And so, if somebody that wants to be offended will be. You can only go so far with something like that. I'd be curious to know if that fully answered your question or not, because I didn't completely understand it.
So feel free to just come back on that question if you don't feel it's completely answered it. I think I'll be amused you. Just picking up on that theme, Andy, we've just got another question which is sort of linked to what you've just saying about social media. And this comes from Wayne. What are your thoughts on the progression of digital media and communication tools and how this has impacted communication skills?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the first thing to say is that there's, whatever the impact on it, obviously, we're now too far down the road to make any changes on it. I.e., that the digital media and phones initially, more latterly social media, is it's a thing. My personal opinion, I'm not quite sure this is going to fully answer your question. I'll try and do that more fully. I think social media, I think it's a bit like a pendulum. I think we will settle down a bit with social media. I think the whole concept of trolling and the aggressiveness that we see on social media, I hope it's not like road rage. I hope it's more like just a fad, a phase, and that we will self-manage into a more measured way of using social media, and social media becomes a little bit of a different thing. Road rage is a bit more of a permanent feature, and it's just it's like a thing. It's a psychology, I guess, of how we change a little bit when we get in the car. I'm hoping that's not the thing with social media, that when we go on social media, we change. How is it impacted on communication skills? I think, well, to give you a specific example, one of the amusing things about it, emojis. Emojis are a funny thing. When they first came out, I thought how childish and stupid they were, and I would never touch them and never use them. But actually, I've realized that what emojis are doing are trying to enable us to communicate feelings and body language and tone in a written message more easily. We had punctuation before. Emojis allow us to add in back some body language and tone to messages and actually enable us to communicate more clearly as a consequence. I mentioned earlier that I'm sure you've all sent a text message to somebody or an email to somebody and got a completely unexpected response, often an angry one, when you didn't mean anything like what you'd intended. You didn't mean it aggressively. You meant it as a joke, for example. Emojis allow us to add in the feeling that, some kind of little winky face that makes it clear that our message is a joke, not serious. The flip side of that, how has that impacted on communication skills in general? I'm not sure I completely buy the whole idea that we can no longer communicate face to face because we're all spending our lives online. I know that's a charge levied at particularly the younger generations. I'm not sure it's true. I think people that find it uncomfortable to communicate face to face, maybe that's exaggerated. That they no longer have quite the same need to learn to communicate face to face because they can spend more time online. But if I look at my kids, for example, they're just as good at communication, and I would argue actually better communicators than I was at the same age. And I would say we're sort of similar kind of people. So I'm not 100% sure. Interesting question, Wayne. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Andy. Just one here that's someone just sharing some advice from Stephen. So this is just advice, Andy, so I don't think requires a response, and we've got a couple of other questions after. So Stephen's just saying, having worked extensively on international projects with colleagues from many different nationalities, a key communication tool is to check the understanding of the recipient by asking them to say back what they think you have said. The potential for misunderstanding between people talking in English as a foreign language is enormous. So I think thank you for that, Stephen. I think useful advice. Any comments on that, Andy?
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree, Stephen. I spend a lot of time delivering these workshops in different parts of the world to people who are speaking English in a second language. First thing I need to recognise is the humility that they are adjusting to my language rather than the other way around. And I have huge admiration for people that are able to operate so effectively in a second language. Nonetheless, clearly, when you're speaking a second language, your understanding, your depth of understanding of the language is quite different than if it's your mother tongue. And so the importance of checking becomes doubly important. The only thing I would say on that, and first, two comments. First, I don't think it's only for people speaking a foreign language. I think it's people speaking a different language well. I think you can extend it to pretty much any really important message. It's useful to get this response, and what you're talking about there is getting a response by asking questions and asking them to check, so that you can check if you've got your message across effectively. Second thing, though, is that it can come across as patronising. If every time you speak to someone, you say, "Would you mind just repeating back to me what I've just said?" It can come across as patronising. I don't want to give you tips, but what I do in that circumstance is, rather than saying, could you just repeat back to me what I've just said, I say, listen, I'm sorry, I don't think I communicated that very effectively. Could you just explain to me what you think I said so I can check? And that way you're shifting the responsibility for being, inverted commas, stupid to me rather than to the receiver. But broadly speaking, I 100% agree with the comment that and it's all about this meaning of the communication is the response that you get. It's about getting a response in order to be able to make the judgment as to whether or not you've been successful in the communication. There are other things you can do as well, by the way. This was seeing as it wasn't a question, this is a hugely long answer. Apologies for that. But you can ask questions. So if you've given someone some directions to do a task, instead of saying, can you repeat back to what I've just said, you can say, any idea where you're going to start? So it's beginning to get a response, and you can begin to make a judgment as to whether or not someone's understood. So there are different techniques for doing that.
Cool. Thank you for those inputs, Andy. So we've got a few minutes left, 9 minutes, so time for a few more questions. Just got a couple lined up, so if anyone else has any burning questions, try and get them in there soon. So this from Jonathan, I think it's quite an interesting one. So, any experience of how to approach a situation when it is difficult to imagine the recipient's perspective and tailor your communication accordingly?
Yeah, I was expecting this question because, of course, a significant proportion of the time we're speaking to people that we've never met before. And so there's very little opportunity for us to make a personal, and I mean that in the most appropriate way, a personal judgment or assessment of how they see the world. We can do it on a sort of a general level, always. So you're talking to different professions. You can make a best guess. So if I'm speaking to an accountant, I would speak in different terms than if I'm speaking to an engineer, for example. To answer the question a bit more directly, if you really haven't got any information at all about the participant's perspective, it's about trying to be as it's still about making your best guess. Then it's about being very focused on responses that you're getting to try and assess and judge whether or not you're getting your message across. That's the first thing. Second thing is actually ask some questions before starting to communicate and try and get a bit of a feel for the person's as I like to call it, or perspective.
Lovely. Thank you, Andrew. So one from Justin. How do you alter your own thinking prior to delivering a message when you have a varied multi-company experience and your colleagues have only worked for one company for a long time?
How do you alter your own thinking? So I think interesting question. If you might need to explain that a little bit more, Justin. I'm going to give you an answer, but I'm not sure I'm answering the right question. So what I think you're saying is you don't alter your own thinking. Essentially, your thinking is your thinking, and the way you see things is the way you see things. What a couple of those TED Talks that are on the screen, particularly the Julia and Michael TED Talks are about, is about recognizing that we need to have the humility to see that our perspective is limited. So it's not so much about altering your thinking. Maybe it's about altering the confidence in your thinking. What I would say you alter is your message. So you think about your message in your terms, and then you think about how the person's going to receive the message, and adjust accordingly. Now, the implication of your question is that you feel that perhaps you having a multi-company experience has given you a wider perspective. And so it might be that in the meantime, you might want to be trying to widen your colleague's perspective. And that's a valid thing to do as well. But it's in the moment, you need to try to deliver the message in their terms. I'd be curious to know again if that did answer the question.
So perhaps Justin might come back on that if he's online still, and as to whether that did answer your question. Just an observation again from Madhusudanan. When I want to send a message effectively, I try to visualize how the recipient will interpret it given his personality, language skills, emotional makeup, and the nature of the purpose of the message, and then adjust the content, tone, and body language to suit. In effect, a message with the same intent may be transmitted in different ways. Somehow it has worked fairly well for me so far.
Good. Basically, it's essentially just what I've been saying this afternoon, more accurately. That absolutely, it's about trying to understand and get a feeling for how the other person's going to interpret. Yeah, very good.
And we'll probably just pick up one last question. And again, this is from Justin, actually, and I think that will just take us to our 1 o'clock slot. So, Andy, last one. Do you believe, I'm not sure if you've answered this, but I think you alluded to it in one of the early questions. Do you believe the art of face-to-face communication is changing / declining with the rise of digital communication?
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say that one again?
Of course, yeah. So do you believe the art of face-to-face communication is changing and declining with the rise of digital communication?
Yeah, similar question to, I can't remember who asked it earlier, was it Jonathan? But I know that the answer is no. The short answer is no, I don't. I think it's changing rather than declining. So I've sort of answered one no and one yes, I guess. I think that it's changing. And I think social media is, as we were talking about earlier on, is a little bit of a factor in that. And I think perhaps digital world enables people that really don't want to communicate face to face or don't feel confident communicating face to face. It enables them to work more online, which could be both a good thing or a bad thing. So perhaps that people that aren't motivated to be around people more, they don't develop their skills as they would through the practice of doing it in a face-to-face environment, because they're working more online. But you could flip that around and say, well, at least it gives them the opportunity to communicate more than they would otherwise. So I think it's got pros and cons. Broadly, I don't think it's declining, no. But I do think it's changing subtly. I've just noticed, by the way, that the response, huge apologies for the terrible mispronunciation of your name, Obianuju. As a female engineer, I find women, we're just about to run out of time. Thank you for clarifying. It's a bit of an generalization, but there is a little bit of a difference between the way in which the genders communicate. So I recognise that.
Cool. I'm going to have to interject there, Andy, because I think we've got about 30 seconds left before we get shut off. So just to say thank you very much to Andy, and for those of you who've taken the time to log in and join the conversation, join the questions. We're going to wrap that up there. I believe links to the webinar will be sent out. There was a question from someone who joined the webinar late. I believe a link to the webinar will be sent out, and it will be accessible online for a period of time after. We will also put that link on the IMechE's management group LinkedIn site so people can get access to it later. So that's all for myself and Andy. Thanks very much for joining in, and we may see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.